All right. At another salon today, and getting ready to sharpen 3 pair of shears that I just picked up out of this customer. They've been a great customer for me. Over time, I've managed to work my way into this salon. One of the other sharpeners in this area had retired out finally, and he had been sharpening in the area for 40 plus years. So some of these salons that I actually do now were quite hard to get into, but since he has moved out of the business, he has started recommending me to a number of these salons, and that has been a big help to me, as well as the work that I'm already doing. So it's nice when you can get a nice thumbs up from some of the other local sharpeners in the area. It's actually a good reason to try and be friendly with the sharpeners in your area, because you can scratch each other's backs. The interesting thing about this business is that you don't have to hit everybody, and you don't have to have everybody as a customer. And it is nice if you can kind of team up with a couple of other sharpeners in the area that aren't afraid of you in the work that you're doing there. And that way you can kind of support each other, because there are times when I cannot get out to a salon, and I end up sending somebody else out to the salon that I trust to take care of them for me. So it's always nice for the salons, because then that way they have a couple of different people that they can call on. And I always tell most salons that they're always best off to have at least a couple of sharpeners that they can call on and trust. Of course, I always tell them that I like to be the primary, not the secondary, but I'm always happy to service them anyway. Anyhow, I'm going to go ahead and get started on these pairs of shears, and I'm just going to go ahead and drop this down into place so you can kind of see some of the work that I'm going to be doing. I've got my water stone down in this area here, and then my machine right here in front of me. So we'll be starting off with taking these shears apart and then doing some work. But this is actually a true left-handed shear, so I wanted to go through the steps on a true left hand. So I'm going to go ahead and take this one apart. I'm going to do my work on the water stone. I've already dressed the water stone out, so I always make sure that my water stone is very flat. The water stone being flat is very important. If you don't have a good flat water stone, you're going to end up with a ride line on the inside of your shear that can either be positive or negative, and more than likely it's going to end up being negative, because that stone is going to cup over time and wear out in the middle if you're not keeping it flat enough. Always make sure when you take your shears apart as well that you get all of your materials out. So here we've got a spring tension spring that goes underneath the knurled knob on the shear, and then this shear is also doesn't have any kind of a washer in it, because it actually has a ball bearing in the shear. So keep an eye out for those as well. Sometimes the ball bearings are very firmly placed in the shear, and then other times the ball bearings will actually just slip right out with the screw. This shear is what's called a semi-convex shear. It is a golden shear, so there's color on the shear, so we're only going to edge the edge. We're actually not going to do a full convex on this blade. So I've got a 30 micron on my plate right now, and I'm actually probably going to stick with the 30 micron on this one for this particular customer. This particular customer uses these shears for a lot of dry cuts, so I tend to usually stick with the 30 instead of going down to a 15 for those customers that are doing this. I am working right now on a 5,000 grit water stone to dress up the inside of the shear. It's funny too, because when I walked into this salon, she immediately said, "Oh my goodness, I'm so glad that you're here. I was going to call you today." And I dropped my shears. So when I went in, I checked over the shears. Fortunately, there was no damage to the shears. And the set still looked good, but there is a very fine nick in the blade. So all we're going to have to do is just make sure that we dress up the inside of the shear well and create a good ride line on the inside, and then we'll be able to do the sharpening on the shear. We'll just have to make sure that we sharpen past where the nick is. You'll also notice on the stone that while I'm working the shear, I work back and forth, but before I come off of the stone, and I've said this many times, you need to make sure that you come to a complete stop before you lift off. The reason that you want to come to a complete stop is that if you come off with motion, there's a chance that you could actually swing upwards as you come off of the stone and create a slight negative on the inside of the shear. In fact, bad on me, I actually did that today on another shear that I was working on at a different salon, because I was trying to rush and I wasn't paying attention to what I was doing like I should have. And again, that's just an important thing that we do need to remember that we do. We always want to make sure that we are keeping an eye on how we come off of our stones. On this, I typically do all of my work freehand. There is a fixture that comes with this machine. This is one of the machines that I sell, but I've been sharpening for a number of years now, and when I do left-handed shears especially, it usually is much easier for me to do the work freehand because of the ways that I position my hands. One of the gentlemen that I did a lot of training with and cross-training with years ago, Larry Brooks, did most of his sharpening with his left hand, actually. So there was a big help with that. What I'm doing here is I'm actually just pulling some of the burrs off with a bristle brush, because what I want to do is I have to make sure that I get past the nick that's on the scissor, which would be a little bit difficult to see in the camera, but there's a very fine nick about in the middle of the blade, and I need to make sure that I get all the way past that so that the shear doesn't re-nick when it's closed, and there's still just a smidgen of a nick left on that blade. So I'm going to go ahead and dress up just a little bit more in that one area of the shear and then make one complete pass to make sure that I bring a burr up all along the blade. I have my burr brought up. I'm going to actually pull that burr off again. And a lot of people get concerned with a bristle brush like this. This is a bristle brush that's used in knife sharpening from a company in Japan. Unfortunately, they're no longer available to get, but really any softer bristle brush would work for something like this. But what's nice about pulling that burr off is when you go back into the magnifier, because I'm using the magnifier to actually check the work that I'm doing, I can see for certain that I've gotten all the way past the nick that's in there. Now, of course, I'm going to go back to my Waterstone before I do my sharpening process on this blade. Alright, and again, I'm going to go ahead and pull the burr back that I just created. So what I'm doing is I'm going down the inside of the shear, and I'm just using light pressure when I do this. That bristle brush is not going to hurt this steel that's on this shear. You would have to do quite a bit of damage to the blade in order to be able to hurt the steel with a bristle brush like this. Alright, so I've gotten past my nick. So I'm going to respray my Waterstone. Go back to my Waterstone again and just do some touch-up work. My ride line is still perfectly fine on the blade. I could probably skip this step if I wanted to, but I actually never do. I always go back to my Waterstone just to make sure that I get a complete, nice, flat, straight cut on the inside of the shear, and that looks good. I'm going to do the same thing to the second one. Also remember, come to that complete stop before you lift off. You can also see that I'm putting my first finger of my left hand over the screw hole, and that's where the majority of the pressure is coming from. The other two fingers that I have on the blade are just along for the ride. I'm going to come to a complete stop, and it's also important that you come to that complete stop. It's hard to see this in the video, but if I press down on the back side of this, it actually wants to rock back just a little bit. So a lot of times I like to come to a complete stop so that, especially when I take my left hand off of the shear, because I don't want to rotate that spine downward at all and create a positive angle on the inside of the shear either, because that can actually cause that to wrap around the inside tip of the shear and wash that tip out some. So you don't want that. Again, we're going to go ahead, put our polishing disc up. Always make certain that you're paying attention when you're doing left-handed shears. It's very easy to switch over to the right just out of habit and have the wheel spinning in the wrong direction, especially when you're doing the polishing and especially when you're doing it at high speed. Always protect yourself. This business is dangerous. These are tools, not toys. So make sure that you're paying attention to what you're doing when you're doing your work. So I'm going to go ahead and polish my edge up. And this is very similar to how Larry would sharpen with his left hand. I'm just using my right hand because this is a left-handed shear. And it really does make my life a lot easier doing this freehand as opposed to using any of the fixtures. But the fixtures, of course, work really well also. And that's the whole purpose of having the fixtures as well. It takes all of the guesswork out of the work that you're trying to do on the shears. The nice thing about the clean machine is it does have a fixture that can be set for doing either right or left hand shears without any fuss. Alright, so we've got those edges polished up, and now we're going to go ahead and put the shear back together and then remove those burrs. Alright, so we'll take our stud. We're going to install our stud in the shear. Now it always feels a little backwards whenever you're doing left-handed shears. So just be aware of where your hands are at. You always want to make sure that whenever you're dealing with sharp blades that you watch where you put your fingers. You don't want to slice yourself and you don't want to cut yourself if you can help it. Alright. We'll go ahead and put that spring washer back in. Make sure that the little nub is sticking up so that the knurled bottom of the nut will make connection with that. We'll go ahead and set that in place, and we're going to ease the burrs off of the shear. So I'm just closing them slowly, letting the blades touch, but I'm not letting them touch under the full force of their own set. What this does is it alleviates and removes the burrs that were created on the shears, but it also will protect the blades so that we're not doing too much work on the blade and making that shear chew. Particularly if I'm not always sure what the free fall setting is on a shear when I first put it back together. So my free fall looks good now. I'm actually going to test the shear with my left hand, and we'll do a quick test on some tissue and then some hair, which is cutting well all the way up to the tip. It no longer has any kind of a push, and it also has no catch, and it falls right away from the tip. I'm going to do the same thing again. Open this up. Going to do a nice clean cut all the way to the tip, falls away. We're going to test the same thing with hair when we give it back to the customer and let them see the type of work that was done on the shear. So doing a left-handed shear is really no more difficult than doing any other style of shear. In fact, in some ways, for me, it's a lot easier. Most of the sharpeners in this area shy away from the left-handed shears, so I don't have to deal with as much of the damage I have to deal with from time to time on some of the other shears in the area, like in particular this one here. This one was sharpened by somebody else, and there was quite a bit of damage that was done on the inside of the shear because they weren't worked properly. So remember, proper sharpening is always important. We're going to shoot for perfection, settle for excellence, but you do have to understand the process. Doing left-handed shears is very simple. If you ever have any questions about that, don't hesitate to reach out and ask me. My information for contact will be below. If you're ever interested in purchasing pretty much any of the sharpening equipment that's out there, you can always contact me at that contact information as well. I typically will match or beat any advertised price that's online. And I'm always here to help as well. So anytime you have questions, give me a shout. I'm happy to help as much as I can. This is Jim from On the Edge, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.